The first time I met Bradley Thorne, he was standing in front of our data visualization wall as if it were a high-end art gallery, nodding with an air of profound understanding. In reality, he could not comprehend a single byte of data crawling across that screen. He tilted his head, squinted at the live metrics, and then turned to the engineering team. He declared that we needed to turn the raw data into a story, a compelling one, because numbers without narrative were just static. Everyone in the room nodded in agreement, eager to please the new vice president of operations. I did not nod. I simply made a mental note that Garrison Financial had just hired a peacock to do the job of a welder. Bradley introduced himself with a limp handshake and a smile that never reached his eyes. He told us to call him Bradley, drawing out his name like a premium consumer brand. He carried a strong scent of expensive cologne, something reminiscent of sandalwood and vanilla mixed with middle management delusion. He wore that ridiculous smile constantly, as if he were auditioning to be the favorite boss in a sitcom that nobody watched. I watched him scan the floor, passing by marketing, design, and sales before his eyes finally landed on our corner. We were the systems engineering and infrastructure team, the unpretty backbone of the entire financial operation. He told us that we would need to conduct a full audit of our workflows, waving his hand like a priest dismissing sin, and announced that efficiency was his middle name. I wanted to ask if inflated ego was his first. By that point, I had been with the firm for over 17 years. I built the core systems from scratch when we were still renting cloud space by the gigabyte and using spreadsheet files as our primary databases. I had successfully onboarded 6 chief technology officers, outlived 4 chief executive officers, and mentored a dozen brilliant engineers who were now working for massive tech giants. I had no patience for office politics, networking happy hours, or explaining to individuals with business degrees why server uptime was not optional. My sole focus was ensuring our systems worked, every hour of every day, with every anomaly patched before anyone outside of this room even knew it existed. But Bradley did not care about the system integrity. Bradley wanted a certain vibe. On his 4th day, he made the rounds like a politician looking for votes, tossing shallow compliments left and right. He would tell teams that he loved their energy and that we were going to break some paradigms. His words always evaporated on contact, leaving nothing but the faint scent of his cologne. When he finally reached my desk, which was completely devoid of mood lighting or beanbag chairs, he squinted at the live network status map displayed on my screen. He asked what it was, and I explained without turning around that it was the core routing overlay and active load balancing for our transactional system. Bradley immediately cut in, holding his hands up as if I had drawn a weapon, and told me to dumb it down because he did not speak jargon. He laughed loudly at his own joke. I did not laugh, and neither did anyone else on my team. Bradley looked around, still smiling, expecting us to be charmed by his humility. He pointed at the screen and said, "We need to translate this complexity for the rest of the organization to make it look sexy." That was the moment I realized what I represented to him. I was a relic, a blocker, someone to be bypassed. Bradley did not understand what he did not know. He thought the blinking blue lights in the server room were decorative, that our monthly risk reports were optional reading, and that cloud infrastructure meant someone else was responsible for everything. Worst of all, he assumed I was just another technical grunt, with no business leverage and no spine. That same week, Bradley canceled our quarterly disaster simulation drill because he claimed it sounded alarmist and unnecessary. He asked the entire department if we really believed the whole system would go down at once, comparing the drill to planning for an alien invasion. Nobody laughed. I looked across the room to see my lead engineer, Keith Barlow, squeezing his water bottle so hard the plastic buckled under his grip. Another engineer, Fiona Ward, was blinking rapidly in disbelief. We were all thinking the same thing. Bradley was going to break something vital, and we would be the ones blamed for the failure. Despite the frustration, I kept my expression completely neutral. I nodded when required and even clapped when he ended the meeting with his favorite phrase about disrupting mediocrity. But once I returned to my desk, I quietly began reviewing our disaster recovery protocols. I created new backups of our backups, verified all access controls, and logged every configuration change Bradley made through his assistants. I had seen men like Bradley before. They arrive with loud promises, rearrange the desks, fire the wrong people to show immediate savings, and then jump ship right before the floor caves in. When the disaster inevitably happens, they blame the architects. I built a fail-safe system quietly and cleanly, without any fuss. It was not an act of revenge, it was simply insurance. Bradley was the sole reason the insurance premium kept going up. The first major warning came in a memorandum, time-stamped at 7:12 in the morning, which read like a corporate death warrant. The subject line announced an immediate cost-cutting proposal for streamlining operations. The document was filled with vague diagrams, bar charts without axes, and phrases about low-hanging fruit. On page 2, the real damage was revealed. Bradley proposed to phase out the secondary uninterrupted power supply backups in Data Wing B, arguing that because the primary power had been stable for 5 years, the redundancy offered no demonstrable return on investment. I stared at the screen until my coffee turned completely cold. Let me be absolutely clear about one thing. Those secondary backups were not luxury items. They were not nice-to-have assets like standing desks or catered lunches on Thursdays. They existed because 6 years ago, a squirrel nested in a utility relay down the road, and half the municipal power grid experienced a massive surge. Our system stayed online during that blackout, not because of luck, but because of careful planning, because of me. Bradley did not know that story, and he did not bother to ask. Later that morning, during a brief meeting that felt more like a corporate drive-by than a collaborative discussion, he smiled and remarked that if the Titanic had possessed better budget controls, they might have skipped the extra lifeboats and saved money. The room laughed nervously. I did not laugh. I looked up from my notepad and stated flatly that the Titanic actually did not have enough lifeboats, and that was the entire problem. Bradley chirped back that those were different times, and modern systems did not need so much redundancy because we had service-level agreements, cloud autoscaling, and mirrored disks. He did not finish his thought, probably because he realized he did not know what those terms actually meant when strung together. He was like a toddler copying adult sounds. That same week, Bradley rejected my quarterly security audit, claiming it was overkill and driven by fear. He argued we were wasting developer hours testing for obscure vulnerabilities. He asked if we really thought hackers cared about us, noting we were not a famous tech giant. Fiona Ward leaned over to me afterward and whispered if we should just send an invitation to ransomware syndicates to save them the trouble of searching for us. I began documenting every single interaction. I did not just keep system logs. I documented everything. Every email Bradley sent that ignored our technical warnings, every chat message where he dismissed our structural concerns, and every line item he redacted from our budget without explanation. I also logged every time he granted system access to external vendors without getting approval from the architecture team. I compiled all this evidence into an encrypted local folder and mirrored it to a cold storage device, kept safely in my desk drawer. I labeled the folder policy reference, but in my own mind, I called it the Ark. I knew the flood was coming, and I wanted indisputable proof that we had warned him repeatedly. The cascade of failures had already begun, but Bradley could not hear the rattle in the machine. He approved an update to the continuous integration pipeline that completely broke container versioning, leaving us just one bad push away from a total production outage. He removed our daily system rollback snapshots to reduce storage costs, calling it optimization. He even forwarded a phishing email directly to the finance department, believing it was a legitimate vendor invoice. The email had come from a domain that misspelled our primary vendor name, requesting an immediate wire transfer. Fortunately, I caught the flag in our mail gateway queue before the transaction could be processed. I spent my evenings correcting his mistakes like a janitor cleaning up after a parade of toddlers. I did all of this quietly and invisibly, because if I did not, the system would collapse. He then sent a company-wide email celebrating a 5% drop in infrastructure costs, calling it optimization in action. Meanwhile, our latency metrics were climbing, customer support tickets were piling up, and the overnight development team was complaining about random access denials from the automation cluster. Bradley claimed it was just a permissions glitch, but I knew better. It was systemic entropy, and it was entirely his fault. To make matters worse, Bradley started pushing for what he called a visual modernization of our administrator dashboard. He complained that the interface looked too sterile and demanded animated charts and bright colors to make it pop. Keith Barlow asked him directly if he wanted the dashboard to be useful or if he wanted it to be cute. Bradley smiled and asked why we could not have both. He did not understand that this dashboard was not a toy. It was the primary control center for our financial portfolio management engine, which was responsible for handling a $300 million portfolio. That was the moment I stopped trying to change his mind. You cannot discuss architecture with a peacock. You cannot explain to someone who has never held a wrench why duct tape does not belong on a high-pressure valve. You simply wait for the explosion and then present the manual they refuse to read. I updated our disaster recovery protocol that night. I did not alter the main scripts. I simply moved the cryptographic recovery keys into a separate legal escrow clause. This clause was designed to trigger automatically if a senior executive bypassed critical system redundancy without engineering consensus. Under federal law, specifically Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, executives must certify the integrity of financial controls, which includes system availability. If those controls are altered without engineering approval, the system enters a compliance protective state. I designed the protocol so that the decryption escrow keys would immediately transfer to our corporate legal counsel, preventing any unauthorized configuration overrides. Legal signed off on the update without reading it, assuming it was just a routine compliance renewal. It was a boring line in a document nobody cared about, but it meant that when the ship started sinking, I would control the lifeboats. The meeting invitation arrived under the title of Infrastructure Pulse Check, which sounded harmless enough. I walked into the conference room expecting a half-baked pep talk or another presentation on corporate synergy. Instead, I walked into a boardroom firing squad. The room itself was cold, dominated by a large mahogany table and glass walls that overlooked the downtown skyline. On the whiteboard, Bradley had written a series of buzzwords like velocity, cost optimization, and modern paradigms. Bradley sat at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, a coffee cup in one hand and a smug grin on his face. Sitting around him were 3 junior engineers, 2 analysts from the DevOps team, and Beatrice Finch from Human Resources. Beatrice was the kind of person who claimed to be a culture ambassador right before filing a performance flag against you. Bradley started by saying he wanted to keep things casual and get a sense of where we stood. I did not sit down. I leaned against the doorframe with my arms crossed, watching him try to project authority. He began with a few superficial compliments about our past migration project, and then he pivoted to his real agenda. He suggested that we might be over-allocating technical resources in certain areas and clinging to legacy frameworks out of caution. He looked directly at me and noted that I had been with the company for over 17 years. I responded immediately, stating that during my tenure, I had worked under 4 chief technology officers, managed 6 different compliance frameworks, and overseen 2 physical server relocations with 0 infrastructure breaches. Bradley nodded with mock appreciation, calling it impressive. But then he added that long tenures can sometimes breed rigidity and a reluctance to evolve. He smiled at the junior engineers and noted that we were still running our own private certificate authority for internal service communications, calling it retro. I stared at him deadpan and told him it was also the reason our financial platform had not been hijacked by a simple script. I explained that our private certificate authority issues custom cryptographic certificates that secure communications between our microservices, preventing man-in-the-middle attacks. Using a public authority for internal queries would introduce latency and security risks that our compliance framework forbids. Beatrice Finch shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clicking her pen repeatedly and looking toward Bradley for direction. She cleared her throat and mentioned that Human Resources always seeks to align personnel with corporate efficiency goals. One of the junior engineers, Owen Fletcher, looked down at his laptop, appearing embarrassed to be in the room. Bradley laughed off the tension, calling it passion, but argued that passion needed to be balanced against cost. He revealed that my salary had raised eyebrows during his budget review when comparing my cost to output. Bradley suggested that we could outsource the core maintenance to offshore developers in Eastern Europe for a fraction of the cost, arguing that modern cloud tools did not require such high-priced internal oversight. He explained that these remote teams could manage the servers using standardized templates, completely ignoring the fact that our systems were highly customized to handle real-time transactional volumes. I listened to him speak, realizing he was describing a fantasy. An offshore team would take hours to respond to a database deadlock, and they would have no understanding of our custom load balancing layers. Bradley was telling me that I was too expensive, too old, and in his way. I did not argue. I looked at the thin folder he was holding, which contained nothing but human resources templates and red-lined budget sheets. He had not read a single page of my system architecture notes, my compliance logs, or the detailed risk memos I had submitted. He did not care about performance. He was simply creating a paper trail to justify my termination when the layoffs arrived. I walked out of the room before he could finish his sentence. I did not slam the door or say a word. I went straight back to my desk, opened my secure vault drive, and accessed a specific compliance document from our previous security audit. It contained an obscure authorization escrow clause designed for critical reorganizations. It allowed me to trigger a safety protocol that moved root configuration key custody into legal escrow. The protocol froze administratives' access to the server deployment files and locked down escalation paths. It could only be reversed by a majority vote from the board of directors or a formal override from the chief information security officer, a role we did not currently have filled. I executed the script quietly. It ran in 12 seconds, logged as a routine system maintenance task. I then sent a short email to our legal counsel with the subject line confirming the custody transfer. I received an acknowledgement from them 8 minutes later, confirming that the escrow was engaged. I felt a cold sense of relief. My architecture was now protected by a legal barrier that Bradley could not touch. When the system broke, and I knew it would, nobody would be able to fix it without my direct involvement. I did not feel victorious. I felt empty, having spent 17 years building a system that was now being treated as disposable. I had tried to guide Bradley, simplifying my language and rewriting warnings, but he refused to listen. I was done trying. I would let the peacock strut. I had the logs, the keys, and the backup plans. We would see how confident he felt when the lights went out. The final confrontation happened in the main server room, a cold space filled with the constant hum of cooling fans and blinking blue lights. The air smelled of dust and ozone, a familiar scent that had defined my working life for nearly 2 decades. The room was organized with rows of metal cabinets, their glass doors showcasing the servers that process millions of dollars in transactions. Thick bundles of blue Ethernet cables were routed neatly along the ceiling, secured with Velcro straps, a design I had personally spent weeks refining to ensure clean airflow. Bradley gestured toward the server rack and made his joke to the department. He asked if all of this was just to look pretty, claiming his daughter had a nightlight that does more. He laughed, expecting everyone to join in. The room went completely silent. Keith Barlow froze and Fiona Ward stopped typing. The junior engineer Tobias Miller stared at the floor, unable to make eye contact. Bradley did not even notice the tension. I did not say a single word. I slowly closed my laptop, the click of the lid sounding like a latch falling into place. I stood up, took one last look at the racks I had spent years configuring, and slid my security badge into my pocket. Bradley asked where I was going, and I replied that I was going to lunch, and we would see after that. He nodded, completely oblivious to what had just occurred. He turned back to the remaining engineers and suggested they begin decommissioning the secondary node cluster to save power. Fiona tried to warn him that the cluster was not cosmetic, but Bradley brushed her off, repeating his slogan that lean was clean. I walked out of the server room and never looked back. I did not file a 2-week notice or write a sentimental farewell message. Instead, I printed a single page, signed it, and delivered it to the legal department. It was a formal declaration of immediate resignation under Clause 14C of my contract, citing hostile work environment and public undermining of my technical role. I met with lawyer Clara Jenkins in the legal office. Clara looked at the document, her expression turning serious, as she recognized the specific clause. She noted that my resignation would immediately trigger the security escrow protocol, locking the system recovery keys. She asked if I was sure about this decision, and I told her that Bradley had made it impossible to maintain system integrity. She accepted the document and wished me luck, acknowledging that the firm was about to face a major crisis. I returned to my desk, packed my belongings, and walked out of the building. But before I left, I wrote a single sentence on a yellow post-it note and stuck it to the side of my monitor. It read that the restore key was in escrow with legal counsel and could only be released by a majority board vote. I also posted a brief update in our private engineering channel, stating that I had resigned and referencing the security rotation hash. I did not send it to Bradley. He did not deserve the warning. The countdown began the moment I closed my laptop. My script had revoked the foundational heartbeat token. Without that token, the automated security credentials began their grace periods. 18 minutes after I walked out, the main authentication certificate expired. Normally, the system would have routed traffic to the secondary cluster, but Bradley had already ordered the backup nodes in Data Wing B to be powered down. There was no safety net to catch the fall. The transaction queue began to back up rapidly, delaying financial processing. The client dashboard stopped refreshing, and the user application began returning 503 errors. Within minutes, the support department was flooded with complaints. Keith Barlow and Fiona Ward scrambled to identify the issue, but they were locked out of the core orchestration directory. The system was failing perfectly, just as I had anticipated. Bradley was left staring at a screen filled with red alerts, completely unable to explain to the executive team why the company's main financial engine had ground to a halt. From a coffee shop across town, I watched the system metrics fluctuate wildly on my phone using a read-only credential. I ignored the missed calls and urgent emails from the office. I had spent 17 years holding up the architecture, and the moment I stepped away, the ceiling began to sag. Bradley had assumed that our redundant systems were unnecessary expenses, and now he was learning the true cost of his ignorance. The monitoring tools still showed the network routes were open, but the databases refused to communicate. Every server was waiting for a cryptographic handshake that could not happen because the validation keys had expired. Fiona and Keith tried to force a reboot, but the system simply rolled back to its secure state, demanding the escrow decryption key. Bradley tried to run a manual script to bypass the security layers, but his junior access level was rejected by the system firewall. Power is easy to claim when the water is calm, but when the storm hits, people quickly remember who actually knows how to run the ship. The financial engine was losing money by the second, and the executive team was in a state of absolute panic. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the quiet sunlight. The illusion of control had shattered, and the keys to restore the system were locked in a vault that Bradley could not open. The conference room was filled with chaos when the chief executive officer, Donald Garrison, arrived. He was in his gym clothes, visibly sweating and demanding to know where I was. The chief technology officer was unraveling, trying to read our system diagrams without success. Bradley tried to explain that I had resigned, but Beatrice Finch interrupted, explaining that I had departed under Clause 14C due to hostile behavior. The general counsel confirmed over the speakerphone that the decryption keys were officially locked in legal escrow and could only be released by a majority vote of the board of directors. The general counsel explained that overriding the escrow without a formal board resolution would violate our financial compliance filings, exposing the executive team to personal liability for violating Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The chief executive officer turned to Bradley, his face pale with anger. He asked Bradley if he had really cut the backup power systems and decommissioned the redundant nodes in Data Wing B. Bradley tried to defend his actions, claiming he was modernizing the infrastructure and that my warnings were obsolete. The chief technology officer snapped back that those warnings were our actual protection and that Bradley had removed the lifeboats before the ship sank. Fiona Ward pointed out that I had left a full audit trail and that the system was locked because nobody else had bothered to learn how the architecture functioned. The chief technology officer added that they could not bypass the security escrow because it was built directly into the boot sequence of our virtual server templates. Any attempt to rebuild the servers from scratch without the keys would require downloading backups that were also encrypted with those keys, meaning the entire system was completely inaccessible. The chief executive officer realized that Bradley's arrogance had cost them their senior architect and crippled their $300 million portfolio engine. He ordered legal to draft an emergency motion for the board of directors to release the keys, and then he turned to Bradley and fired him on the spot, telling him to leave the building immediately. Security was called to escort Bradley out, and his access was completely revoked. Bradley gathered his phone and papers, his hands shaking as he realized his career was ruined. He tried to argue that he was only trying to show cost savings on his quarterly report, but the chief executive officer warned him that the company would pursue legal action against him for breach of fiduciary duty and violation of federal compliance standards. Bradley stood up and walked out in silence, escorted by two security guards. The junior engineers, Owen Fletcher and Tobias Miller, watched in silence, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety about the system recovery. The board of directors quickly held an emergency session over an online video call. The meeting was tense, with members joining from different time zones and offices across the country. They reviewed the compliance reports and the history of system audits. The legal counsel, lawyer Clara Jenkins, explained that the key transfer was a standard risk prevention measure built directly into the company bylaws to protect client assets from unauthorized executive decisions. She emphasized that bypassing the escrow without a formal board resolution would violate their compliance filings, leaving the firm open to severe regulatory fines and lawsuits from investors. After a quick discussion, the board members voted unanimously to approve the release of the escrow keys, acknowledging that Julian was the only person capable of restoring order. The chief executive officer sent me a direct text message stating they would pay whatever I asked to bring me back. He promised a significant raise and full autonomy if I returned to restore the databases. I received the message while sitting at the airport gate, waiting for my flight. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction, but I had no intention of returning to a company that only valued my work after the system crashed. I knew that returning would only lead to another encounter with an incompetent executive in the future. My phone rang, and I answered to hear the voice of Walter Mercer, a recruiter representing a major technology firm. He explained that they had reviewed my system architecture logs and were deeply impressed by my discipline and the resilience of the systems I had built. He offered me a full chief technology officer role with guaranteed autonomy at a major financial technology platform that managed a $2 billion asset pool. He explained that their board of directors had already approved a highly competitive compensation package. It included a substantial signing bonus, performance stock options, and full medical coverage, which was significantly higher than my previous salary. More importantly, he assured me that I would have complete authority over all infrastructure decisions and would report directly to the chief executive officer. They did not want another executive to interfere with system stability. I accepted the offer, knowing I was finally going to a place that respected engineering. I powered off my phone as the gate agent announced boarding for my flight to Chicago. I walked down the jet bridge, leaving the chaos of Garrison Financial behind me. They had called my infrastructure a nightlight, and now they would have to find their way through the dark without me. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you are my old boss, then you are on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes.